Hello. So today we'll be talking about whether the Ukraine war is a proxy war or not. I am very invested in this topic, and my grandmother has experience with the Russians because she lived in East Germany while the Russians were in control, so she has a little bit of knowledge about that, so she's passed that down to me. So I'm bringing some insights from that into this. And today I'll be discussing whether the Ukraine war is a proxy war or not. I'll be talking about the history of Ukraine and Russia. I will be talking about how the conflict started. And in the end, I will finally talk about whether I believe it's a proxy war or not. So the history of Ukraine and Russia is somewhat complicated. Ukraine used to be a member of the USSR, and the peasant farmers of Ukraine, were very resistant to the rule of Russia, and therefore Russia imposed a famine on Ukraine called the Holodomor, and this was not a famine caused by environmental conditions, disease, or anything like that. This was a human-caused famine, which many call a genocide of the Ukrainian people, and this led to people about 1/8 of the Ukrainian population dying within 2 years, and it um, led to people eating uh, other people in the most extreme cases, and they would eat rats, grass, anything they could eat because there wasn't any food. Um, Following the fall of the USSR, Ukraine became its own republic, and they've had a democratic country since then. Um, and because of the Holodomor and other actions by the Russian government, the majority of the Ukrainian people have uh, a sort of distaste in their heart for the Russians. Um, they, but the issue is Russia. Uh, its biggest export is fossil fuels. It's about 70% of its GDP. So um, the Ukrainian people have to kind of depend on Russia for certain things like that, and therefore they have to kind of keep close ties with Russia. Um, and about a third of the population speaks Russian, especially in the eastern part of the country. A large part of them speak Russian. So, what is a proxy war? A proxy war is a war instigated or fought on behalf of a power which does not itself become directly involved. So, some wars we can look at would be the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and the Soviet-Afghan War. So, we'll just give you a little background on these wars. So, with the Vietnam War, the North, which was the communist regime, was supported by um, China and Russia, and they supported like the Viet Cong and the communist government of Vietnam, while we fought for the democratic government of Vietnam. We eventually ended up losing this conflict and fled. And then there's the Korean War, where the northern half of Korea was under communist rule and was supported by China. We supported the southern half of Korea and fought against the northern part of Korea, the communist regime, and we 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 came to a ceasefire, and there's still a ceasefire to this day. That's why they have the DMZ, which is the demilitarized zone. So um, yeah, still in a ceasefire. Didn't technically lose, but didn't get what we wanted because now we have North Korea, which is a communist power and is very totalitarian. And then the third war we can look at would be the Soviet-Afghan War. So the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and we funded the Mujahideen, which were the students who opposed the um, Russian rule, and eventually, which is very um, ironic, the Mujahideen became the Taliban, and then we fought the Taliban, which we funded. So it's a very complicated subject. So the sides of the current conflict. So Russia is backed by China, Iran, North Korea, Belarus, India, Syria, Mali, and Myanmar. So China is Russia's biggest ally. They're our biggest rival next to Russia, or not next to Russia. Russia's next to China, but our biggest rival. So uh, yeah, they're backed by China, Iran. They help Iran, and with the current Israel-Palestine conflict, they support Iran, and Iran supports Hamas, which fought against Israel. And then Belarus, we can look at Belarus. Belarus was one of Russia's states when they were still the USSR, and they still have an agreement with Belarus where they are a separate nation, but they're still kind of under the rule of Russia. And eventually they want to merge the countries. And then there's some smaller ones like Syria, Mali, and Myanmar. And then Ukraine is supported by NATO, the North Atlantic Trade Organization, and the EU, the European Union, and the majority of other democratic countries. And the significance of this is that if Ukraine would have joined NATO before the conflict started, it would have led to a war with Russia because NATO has um, they will support each other in the event of a conflict. It's a defense contract. Okay, there we go. So why did the conflict start? There are many reasons. These are four of the big ones. So the first, Yanukovych. Yanukovych was the president of Ukraine up until around 2013 and 2014. Um, and he had ran against another candidate, and Yanukovych was very pro-Eastern, whereas the other candidate was pro-Western. And the first election in 2002 or 2004, I forget the exact year, I believe it was 2004, the other candidate won. And then after that, Yanukovych won, and he was in power, and Ukraine was largely leaning towards joining NATO, but um, the president, Viktor Yanukovych, did not sign the agreement with the European Union, and he opted instead for having closer ties with Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. This decision triggered lots of events, and the main one being the Euromaidan protests. And these were large protests which eventually led to Yanukovych fleeing to Russia and Zelensky gaining power in 2014. So, or not 2014. He gained power later. But this is a big part of it because after he was removed, separatist movements in the East decided to fight back against Ukraine, and they were backed by Russia. And this is where we first see the Little Green Men in 2014. And the Little Green Men were, many believe, Russian soldiers that did not have any Russia insignia on them. So they were Russian, but Russia denied any allegations that they were part of the conflict. Um, Lots of people suspect that they were part of the Wagner Group and that they were fighting for these separatist movements. Um, and then eventually, yeah, so the opposition leader who he ran against in the first election, Timoshenko, he got released from jail because Yanukovych put him in jail. And yeah, so there was lots of fire in the eastern part of the country, which eventually led to the annexation of Crimea, and in 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So the next thing is irredentism. So irredentism is a term that means is a retaking of old uh, parts of your country. So Russia um, believes that Ukraine is should be part of Russia, right? Um, they believe that historically and culturally, Ukraine is part of Russia, especially from the USSR, and uh, pro Russian people in the East fought back against the Ukrainian government, and this obviously led to the invasion in 2022. East-West rivalry. This is a big one. I mean, Russia didn't want Ukraine to join NATO because then that would have meant that he had less of a hold on countries in this Eastern Europe region. He already has control of Belarus, Transnistria, which is an independent state in Moldova, technically not recognized by the majority of people, and yeah, those two countries are pro-Russian, and that's a big thing with the East-West rivalry. So he doesn't want NATO gaining more control of the Eastern Europe because that would not be beneficial for him. And Ukraine's Nazis. So there's quotation marks around the Nazis. Um, Russia or Putin justified his attack by saying that Zelensky and the whole cabinet of Zelensky's were Nazis, which doesn't make sense because Zelensky himself has Jewish family and parts of his family died in the Holocaust. So Putin's claim that they're Nazis is just absurd. But the man you see here in this picture, I'll kind of draw a circle around him here. That is Yanukovych. So, could the Ukraine war be a proxy war? In my opinion, yes. Um, Based on the other known proxy wars, such as Vietnam, Korea, and the Soviet-Afghan War, the Ukraine war is a classic proxy war. It does not align with the standard definition because technically Russia wouldn't be fighting, but Vietnam doesn't align with that definition. Neither does Korea, nor does the Soviet-Afghan War. So the definition is a little outdated because I believe that you can have one of this big superpowers uh, involved in the conflict and it still be a proxy war. So yes, the Ukraine war is a proxy war between the East and the West, between NATO and between Russia, China, and the Eurasian communist and totalitarian governments. Um, and I believe that, and this is just a little tidbit, the Israel-Palestine conflict is that as well. I mean, if you look at who Russia supports Iran, and Iran supports Hamas, and then we support Israel. It's all a big um, it's a bunch of proxy wars. It's like going back to the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s, 90s. It's all happening again right in front of our eyes, and we should be very in tune to these facts and look at what is actually happening. Um, just stay informed. Uh, Look at everything that's going on. Don't just look at one side. Look at both sides. Look at the people on both sides. Thousands are dying in this conflict. Thousands are dying in Israel and Palestine. It's war is not something that's far off. It affects people that are related to us. I mean, you can find at least one person in our university that's related to someone in one of these conflicts. I mean, me myself, my Uma is very stressed out about this conflict because of what she experienced in the when she was under Russian control. I mean, she doesn't look at the news anymore because of how much it shocks her. She knows what the Russians can do, and she knows what war does, and she's very strict on peace. So I believe that we should look at all wars and try to gain peace any way that we can. And here are my sources. A lot of it was stuff I'd read from the news and stuff, but these are the main sources that I used. All right, thank you. Peace.